Imagine this. You're being chased by a monster of unknown power. No, not you. Your eyes lock on each other, and you realize the horrible truth. Death is not an escape. The killer approaches with heavy, deliberate steps, and you brace for the inevitable. Then, all of a sudden, the unthinkable happens. Right, that's a mood killer, isn't it? Well, that's the current state of the game. Today, I wanted to talk about the story of Dead by Daylight's development. What happened to turn a once gloomy horror game into a pseudo-competitive fashion contest? How did we get here? What changed? And more importantly, can Dead by Daylight find its way back to its roots? Believe it or not, but Dead by Daylight wasn't always about neon skins and anime charm packs. Back in 2016, when the game first launched, it had a very different identity, one that leaned more into its dark and grim atmosphere. Having a look at the original kill roster, you immediately get the tone. Trapper, Wraith, and Hillbilly all look terrifying, but in a way that's more grounded and unsettling. These aren't supernatural creatures from another world, these are humans, broken, tormented, and pushed beyond their limits. Survivors, too, were dressed like the average person. Button-up shirts, jeans, just your typical clothes. No neon hoodies, no cat ear headbands, just people trying to survive. And the maps? They weren't brightly lit and oversaturated. They were dark, decrepit, and claustrophobic. The thick fog, dim lights, and eerie sound design all worked together to create a terrifying atmosphere. This was Dead by Daylight in its infancy. A game that fully embraced the horror genre. A game where killers were terrifying, survivors were desperate, and every chase felt meaningful. That, however, does not mean everything was perfect. Dead by Daylight was a clunky and unpolished mess in its early days. The animations were stiff, hitboxes were questionable, even more so than today, and let's not even talk about the infinites. The game felt raw. You weren't just playing against a killer, you were sort of fighting the game itself. Loops weren't precisely calculated, balance was non-existent, and some mechanics barely worked as intended. But that unpredictability was the charm. Anything could happen. You weren't doomed just because the killer brought pain res or because survivors stacked for toolboxes. Matches were chaotic, but in a way that made every game feel unique. Despite its flaws, every encounter felt tense. Killers weren't designed for flashy power plays, they were built for stalking. The game didn't revolve around perfectly looping a killer for minutes. It was about hiding, listening, and waiting. Early Dead by Daylight leaned more into a hide-and-seek style of gameplay than structured chases. You feared the killer, ducking behind obstacles as they approached, hoping, praying that they wouldn't find you. But as players got better at running killers in loops, the horror began to fade. The more time spent staring the killer down, the less scary they got. And that's where things started to change. One of the biggest shifts came from the rise of looping and competitive play. The moment players realized they could exploit map layouts to extend chases, the entire game dynamic changed. Suddenly, it wasn't about hiding anymore. It was about running in circles around a pallet or jungle gym until the killer either broke the pallet or gave up. What was once a game of fear and hiding started becoming a game of loop optimization. The most notorious case of this is the so-called infinites. These weren't just strong loops, they were literally unbeatable if the survivor played them correctly. If a survivor found the right setup, such as a structure with no easy way for the killer to cut him off, they could run the killer in circles indefinitely. The only way to stop them was for the survivor to mess up, or to hope they got bored and left the loop on their own. For survivors, infinites were hilarious.
Oh, the double juke. Oh, triple, quad, quintuple. Oh, I don't even know what 6 is.
But for killers, pure misery. This was of course a massive problem for game balance, but even more so for the horror aspect of the game. Instead of feeling hunted, survivors realized they could completely negate the killer's threat by abusing the right setups. and the better survivors got at looping, the less scary the killers became. After a lot of controversy, Behaviour had no choice but to step in. They introduced Bloodlust and the entity blockers to prevent repeated window vaults. They also tweaked map layouts to remove the most ridiculous loops. But one of the most drastic responses was the introduction of the Nurse, a killer specifically designed to break these loops. Unlike every other killer, she didn't need to chase you around the structure, she could blink straight through it. At the time, she was the only killer who could truly counter infinites. However, this was just another example of how Dead by Daylight's original hide-and-seek type design philosophy led to poor balancing. Looping was never an intended game mechanic. The game was simply not built around extended chases. It was designed around killers finding survivors, not chasing them for minutes at a time. By the time infinites were gone, the mindset of the community had already started shifting. Survivors no longer feared killers, they challenged them. Survivors weren't just figuring out how to loop better, they were discovering powerful perk combinations, item synergies, and strategies that minimized risk entirely. Perks like Decisive Strike, Dead Hard, and Borrowed Time became survival tools so powerful that killers had to completely change the way they played. The game wasn't just about escaping anymore, it was about outplaying. In the early days, Dead by Daylight was simple. If you got caught, you were in trouble. Survivors had to rely on stealth, positioning, and smart decision making to stay alive. But as the meta evolved, so did perk design, shifting the power dynamic between killers and survivors. Initially, perks were meant to give survivors a small edge, like sprint burst for repositioning or self-care for healing without a medkit. But as more perks were introduced, they started removing counterplay entirely. Perks were no longer just about giving survivors a small advantage, they were about erasing mistakes entirely. No longer did getting caught mean you were in danger. With the right perks, survivors could completely reset an interaction that should have ended in their death. And no perk showcases this shift better than Decisive Strike. Originally, Decisive Strike wasn't just an anti-tunneling perk, it was a game-breaking one. If a killer picked up a survivor after they had been unhooked, they would be stunned, allowing the survivor to escape. That's just how it works today, but the difference was the lack of a cooldown or restriction on when it could be used. Survivors could protect their teammates and force the killer to pick them up, wasting the killer's time and resetting chases for free. This resulted in survivors beginning to play more aggressively, knowing they had a second life. In response, killers started to slug, as they had no way to counter the survivor's new playstyle. Tunneling also became more frequent, as it now was required if killers wanted to keep enough pressure on the survivors. Decisive Strike was the first perk that completely changed how both killers and survivors had to play. It forced them to adapt in ways that shifted the entire game's balance, and it wasn't long before more perks started doing the same. While Decisive Strike changed how killers played after a down, Dead Hard changed how they played during the chase. At launch, Dead Hard was completely busted. Instead of granting endurance, it gave full invincibility for a second. It also launched the survivor forward, letting them reach pallets or windows they otherwise wouldn't have without taking a hit. Because Dead Hard was so dominant, killers had to change their entire approach to chases. Instead of relying on quick decision making, they were forced to bait out Dead Hard before swinging. You could no longer just react to survivors' movement, you had to predict when they would press a button and hope they didn't unplay you. Survivors now not only had the power of looping, but also the power of negating killer hits. Not surprisingly, this was a balancing nightmare, and also further removed any sense of fear or dread when seeing the killer approach. At this point in time, Dead by Daylight was not a horror game, but rather a game of mechanical skill and perk interactions. As second chance perks like Dead Hard and Decisive Strike became staples of the survivor meta, the core horror aspect of Dead by Daylight started to fade. Killers were no longer these frightening, looming threats they were meant to be. Instead, killers had to play cautiously, waiting for the survivor to press a button before they could even land a hit. As the fear of being caught disappeared, so did the horror of the game. Furthermore, hooking a survivor no longer meant you had won the interaction. It was just the start of another second chance mechanic that could undo all your pressure in an instant. Survivors weren't helpless anymore. They were confident, aggressive, and in full control. Some of you might recognize a similarity to the critique against the Legion. When they were launched, they were critiqued for many things, including a disappointing ability, but more importantly, they weren't scary. The Legion is just a teenager, the same size as any of the other survivors, and with no significant deformations or signs of resistance against the entity. I mean, hell, just look at the Mori, the survivor almost manages to break free from the killer's grasp. And that's what I'm trying to get at. Dead by Daylight has shifted the power position so much in the survivor's favor that the killer isn't scary anymore. And if we look at the killers in the game that might still make us jump, Myers, Ghostface, Wraith, even Piggy, what do they all have in common? Stealth. They all play on the base mechanic that the game once was built around, fear of the unknown. This shift in power hasn't just affected how the game plays, it has also affected how the game looks. Survivors went from looking like desperate people trying to escape death to looking like they're heading to a neon-lit nightclub. Killers that were once terrifying now run around in bunny costumes and holiday sweaters. Now, to be fair, I'm kind of a fan of these cosmetics. Some of them are really cool, and I personally quite enjoy the competitive aspects of playing an asymmetrical game. But that's just not what this game set out to be. Dead by Daylight was meant to be a horror game. And that brings us to the real question. Why did these changes happen in the first place? How did Dead by Daylight, a game that once thrived on fear and uncertainty, transform into something so different? The answer lies not just in gameplay evolution, but in how Behaviour chooses to run the game. I think we can all agree that Dead by Daylight has changed a lot since launch. The game now has a vastly different gameplay loop. Better, but still imperfect balancing, and perhaps more importantly, has lost its horror factor. However, Dead by Daylight's decline isn't a natural evolution of the game. It's a result of years of mismanagement, wasted resources, and poor prioritization by Behaviour. And this is where the topic becomes very sensitive, because I know there are plenty of talented and hardworking individuals at Behaviour Interactive, and I don't want to take that away from them. The issue still stands though, as Behaviour Interactive as a company repeatedly makes questionable business decisions, falls flat in development direction, and refuses to be transparent with its audience. The first thing I want to get into is the focus on a family-friendly work culture. Behaviour prides itself on being a family-friendly workplace, highlighting how employees frequently bring their families and children to work. On paper, this sounds great. A work environment that avoids crunch, prioritizes employee well-being, and maintains a healthy work-life balance? That should be a good thing, especially in the gaming industry, which is infamous for overworking developers. But here's the problem. While a healthy work culture can improve productivity, Behaviour's approach seems to have done the opposite. Unlike other live service games that push out fast, efficient updates, Behaviour has become known for slow, inconsistent patches with poor quality control and delayed responses to major issues. Just take the most recent 2v8 event for instance. There has been a major issue with Wesker's ability, where survivors get stuck being carried around by the killer instead of being sent to cages, effectively ruining the match. 2 weeks since the event's launch, and we still have seen no patch. If this would have been an issue with exploits in Valorant or Counter-Strike, you can bet it would have been hotfixed within 48 hours. In fact, I would argue these bugs even being present in the live game shows a lack of proper quality assurance. This is further emphasized by another bug that plagued the game for weeks, where one part of the map would despawn so you could run outside the map. This would have been fine 8 years ago when Behaviour Interactive was an indie studio, but not anymore. They are securing million-dollar deals with some of the most famous horror franchises in the world. There is just no excuse. If Behaviour's family-friendly work culture truly resulted in a fluent development process, we would be cheering for them. But instead, it seems to prioritize comfort over urgency to a point where it feels like the game is playing catch-up with the rest of the industry instead of moving forward. Undoubtedly, this work ethic, or lack thereof, has resulted in a lot of the talents from the original team leaving the company. When the focus isn't on making the game, passion is lost. And when passion is lost, productivity decays. That's what we're seeing with Dead by Daylight, a game that has lost the passion and drive to improve. Behaviour are content with the game and treats customers like their friends. The players are supposed to forgive Behaviour for their mistakes, for their misses in QA, for the bugs, the balancing, for everything they mess up. However, that's just not how a company is run. The company has to put out the product that the customer wants, and if we as players no longer like how Dead by Daylight is being run, we will go elsewhere. I feel it's about time that we as a community start demanding more from the developers. We need to make them understand that the game is not in a good state and they have not done a pretty good job so far. So, with everything in mind, what does the future of Dead by Daylight hold? Well, as we know, Behaviour is far from perfect, but I feel there are still reasons to be optimistic. Behaviour are a lot more responsive in recent months than they've ever been, and they are actively testing how different changes affect the player base. They've also been experimenting with the new game modes such as 2v8 and keep signing deals with huge horror icons like Junji Ito and Five Nights at Freddy's. I believe that the FNAF collaboration in particular will bring a huge surge of new players this summer, and hopefully Behaviour takes the time to fix the most glaring flaws by then. The FNAF collaboration is the best chance they have had in a while to bring in a massive wave of new players, and if they can't fix the game by then, if they don't address the player feedback before the biggest horror collab in DBD history, they may never get another chance. Dead by Daylight has come a long way from its horror roots. What started as a tense game of hide and seek has become something completely different. One where optimization, second chance mechanics and cosmetics have overtaken the fear and unpredictability that once defined the game. Some players love the changes, others hate them, but what matters is that Behaviour doesn't seem to have a direction anymore. And if they don't act soon, if they don't take the FNAF collaboration as an opportunity to fix the game, they may never get another chance. So, what do you think? Is Dead by Daylight about to be revived, or are we all doomed? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, and as always, have a fantastic day.